Hi, my name is Nicole Byrne, and today I will be sharing with you the importance of the Department of Education. Unfortunately, this is a opportune time for it. As of last Friday, President Donald Trump had signed an executive order to just slowly dismantle the Department of Education. Let me just pull up my slides real quick for us today. And let's see. Ha, there we are. So, at a time when public education is under attack, some argue that the federal government should step back and let states take control. But as history tells us, this is a dangerous mistake. The Department of Education was created to protect students, ensure equal access to education, and hold states accountable. Dismantling it would not only roll back decades of progress, but would also harm our most vulnerable students. Today, I'll walk you through the history of the Department of Education, the current threats that it faces, the theories that supports federal oversights, the counter-arguments and why they're flawed, and of course, what we can do to protect it. Because without the Department of Education, millions of students will be left behind. Now, moving to our current events. Let's start with what's happening right now. In June 2024, Donald Trump pledged to shut down the Department of Education, saying that states should have full control. He claimed that this would personalize education and cut bureaucracy. But what would this actually do? Cut federal funding, remove oversight, and open the door to privatization. And looking forward, this is also considered in Indiana's House Bill 1136, a proposal that would dissolve school districts where 50% of the students were involved in non-district schools and forcing public schools to become charter schools. The impact is that it would raise concerns of privatization and loss of public education oversight, showing how state-level decisions can become threatened public education equity. Now, to understand the Department of Education, we have to go back to our presidents. Let's start first with the Johnsons. In 1867, President Andrew Johnson was actually the first president to have a cabinet position for the Department of Education. However, due to fear of too much control and oversight, it was demoted to the Office of Education, where its sole purpose was to collect data on our students. In 1965, almost 100 years later, Lyndon B. Johnson had passed this Elementary and Secondary Education Act to direct federal funds towards low-income schools. 1980, Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education, recognizing that states weren't alone in assuring fairness. Then, almost 20 years later after that, George W. Bush had introduced No Child Left Behind Act to increase federal accountability, and President Barack Obama in 2015 reformed it with the Every Student Succeeds Act. Everything from civil rights advancement in education, from desegregation to disability rights, has been driven by the federal oversight, not state generosity. If we truly eliminate the Department of Education, history tells us who will suffer the most. Low-income students, students of color, and the students with disability. So, let's get to my favorite part, the theory. So, these four scholars that you see here each had approached education from a different angle, but they all lead us to the same conclusion. The Department of Education is essential for a just and effective society. First, Martha Nussbaum argues that should go beyond test scores and economic value. It should foster empathy, critical thinking, and active citizenship. She reminds us that education shapes who we are, not just what we are. Next, Gary Becker offers an economic lens with his human capital theory. He shows us that investing in people through their education, skills, and health showed greater returns than investing in machines and infrastructure. In other words, education drives the long-term national growth. Then, moving over, we have Gloria Ladson Billings, who reframes the achievement gap as an educational debt, a debt owed to students of color and those living in poverty due to decades of discrimination and neglect. Her work pushes us to acknowledge that inequality in schools is deeply rooted in systematic injustice. Finally, Linda Darling Hammond had emphasized that Brown v. Board of Head may have ended legal segregation, but in reality, the segregated schools and underfunded schools still persist. She had argued for strong federal involvement to make equity more than just a promise on paper. Together, these theories remind us that education is not just a local or personal concern, it's a civil right, an economic strategy, and a moral obligation. And that's why the Department of Education matters. Now, let's talk about one of my favorite founding fathers here, Thomas Paine. The ideas of Thomas Paine can get, oh, sorry. The ideas can get traced back through political theory and political theater thinkers, such as Thomas Paine's Common Sense, where he wrote, "Society is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is a necessary evil. Without the oversight of government that society can suffer. Students, especially in the field of special education in low-income areas, would greatly be impacted without the Department of Education. In Common Sense, Paine had argued that citizens should be empowered to speak out, which is present in our modern society today. James Pratt, James Madison, who was not only another president, had written in the Federalist Papers, "There are but two methods of providing evil, the one by creating a will in the community independent of the majority, that is, of society itself, the other by comprehending that in society so many separate descriptions of citizens as well as rend an unjust combination of the majority of the whole very improbable, if not impractical." The arguments of a liberal democracy and the role of a government connecting Madison's beliefs in a stronger federal system align with the goals of the Department of Education, as he would have argued for a centralized government during the founding of the U.S. Constitution. So, John Dewey, who had influenced some of Martha Nussbaum's work, had argued that education is a democratic public good and essential for fostering active citizenship. He warned against the privatization and believed that it would undermine democracy and equality. Having criticized vocational education, thinking that corporate demands mold and undermine democratic education by reducing it to technical job training, which could cause an imbalance in social classes and lessen our civic engagement. These are some of the programs that the Department of Education actually works with. So, what does the Department of Education do? It protects our individuals with disability through the IDA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which guarantees free and appropriate education for students with disabilities, provides Title I funding, which is a federal assistance to schools serving low-income communities, offers Pell Grants and federal student loans to expand access to higher education for low-income students, and of course, as we discussed with President Obama, has the Every Student Succeeds Act, which holds states accountable for student outcomes. Without these programs, millions of students would lose critical support. So, Everyone's favorite part. Let's talk about the counter arguments and the to be sures. So, education should be left to the states. It's a common argument that this should happen, that local governments know their communities best and federal involvement just gets in the way. On paper, this does sound reasonable, but history tells us a different story. When education has been solely left to the states, there are marginalized students that are often left without protections. There is no guarantee to equal access, equal funding, or even equal treatment. Federal oversight doesn't erase local control, it strikes things at. It does set the baseline to make sure no state can fall below minimum standards of equality. It ensures that no matter where a child lives, they have the right to a fair and inclusive education. Local flexibility is important, but without accountability, it becomes inequality, and that's why the Department of Education is not just helpful, it's necessary. So, some critics claim that the Department of Education is just a bloated bureaucracy and that it duplicates what states already do and wastes taxpayers' dollars. But here's the truth. This department isn't just about red tape. It's resources, it's rights, and more importantly, it's results. The Department of Education distributes critical funding to states that often can't or won't provide on their own. Title I helps low-income schools. Pell Grants make college possible for millions, and the IDA ensures students with disabilities get the support they need. They're not just the extras, these are essentials. Without the department, those funds and protections would disappear or become deeply unequal across states. While it's easy to criticize bureaucracy, we have to ask, what happens when that so-called bureaucracy is the only thing standing between a child and their right to learn? The Department of Education makes sure no matter where you're from, you have a chance. And that's not a waste. That's justice. Now, there are a few people who would argue that the Department of Education, its federal oversight, would stifle innovation and hold back states from being creative, that Washington imposes rigid standards and limits new ideas. But let's make this clear. Oversight is not the enemy. In fact, the Department of Education creates conditions for meaningful innovation by ensuring equity and accountability. What good is an innovative program if it only works for students in wealthy zip codes? What happens when a new approach ignores students with disabilities or English language learners? Without federal floor experimentation, it can become exploitation. The Department of Education, the Department of Education doesn't micromanage. It sets the baseline. It says every child deserves a chance. Every state must meet a minimum standard of fairness, safety, and access. And within that framework, states are free to adapt and improve as they see. True innovation can lift everyone, not just those already ahead. Federal oversight helps make sure our education students system evolves without leaving our most vulnerable behind. And some might argue that federal spending on education is too high, and that it would be more efficient to send that money directly to states and cut out the middleman. But this argument misses a crucial point. The federal funding isn't a waste, it's protection. It's a guarantee that resources reach the students who need them the most. Programs like Title I IDA and Pell Grants don't just hand out money, they correct the imbalances. They make sure that a child that in an already underfunded rural or urban school has a real shot, not just a theoretical one. They ensure that students with disabilities, low-income families, and historically marginalized communities aren't left behind because of where they live. Cutting federal spending doesn't mean cutting waste. It means cutting access. It means placing a burden of funding equity entirely on states, which many already have shown they won't or can't meet that need alone. An investment in education is an investment in our future workforce, our democracy, and our national strength. It's not too expensive, and it's too important to cut. Now, some critics like to argue because the Constitution doesn't explicitly mention education, it should be entirely left to the states under the 10th Amendment. But this is a narrow reading of both the Constitution and the purpose of federal power. Congress has the authority to provide for the general welfare and to regulate interstate matters. Education affects both. A well-educated population isn't just a local concern, it's a national one. Workforce readiness, civic participation, economic mobility all depend on a strong, equitable education system. And let's not forget the precedent. The federal government has long intervened when states failed to protect civil rights. The Civil Rights of 1964, Title IX, and IDA are just a few examples where federal involvement wasn't only legal, it was necessary. The 10th Amendment doesn't mean the federal government must remain silent while students are left behind. It means the federal government must act when states fall short of justice. And the Department of Education is one way we ensure that justice is delivered. And talking about previously Brown v. Board of Ed, it wasn't just a landmark case, it was a turning point in the American conscience. In 1954, the Supreme Court had ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, finally acknowledging that separate but equal was anything but equal. This case affirmed that education is not only a privilege for some, but a fundamental right for all. But Brown wasn't about physical school buildings, it was about dignity, opportunity, and justice. It placed responsibility on the failed federal government to step in where the states had failed to protect those rights. And legacy isn't exactly, and that legacy is exactly why the Department of Education matters today. We often think of Brown as a battle we already won, but as Linda Darling Hamilton had already mentioned, in reality, the battle has continued on. From funding disparities to ongoing segregation by zip code, the promise of Brown is still unfulfilled in many communities. That's why the federal oversight is essential. Without it, we risk sliding back into a system where access to quality depends on where you live and what you look like. The Department of Education helps make sure that the values enshrined in Brown v. Board aren't just ideals, they're enforced realities. Another case that examples this is San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. If Brown v. Board of Ed opened up the door to educational equity, Rodriguez reminded us how easily that door could be closed. In the 1973 case, families in Texas had challenged a school funding system based on local property taxes. Wealthy districts had more modern facilities, well-paid teachers, and abundance of resources. Poor districts, often communities of color, struggled with even the basics. The court had ruled that education, shockingly enough, is not a fundamental right under the U.S. Constitution. Let me say that again. Not a fundamental right. That decision upheld a funding system that locked children's education opportunities behind the value of their neighborhood real estate. Rodriguez had exposed a brutal truth that without federal protections and funding, education becomes a reflection of inequality, not a remedy for it. This is why the Department of Education matters so deeply. It's the only way institutions equipped to level the playing field across the states, ensuring that a child's future isn't dictated by their zip code. Without it, we risk turning a public education into a system of privilege rather than a pillar of democracy. So, why does this matter? When it all comes together, dismantling the Department of Education isn't just a policy choice. It's a threat. It's a very idea of equal opportunity. Without federal oversight, burdens fall unevenly. Students with disabilities, students from low-income families, students from underfunded schools, these are the kids who lose the most. The Department of Education ensures that every child, no matter their zip code, has a shot. It enforces civil rights, distributes critical funding, and sets a baseline of equity. Without it, we risk a fractured system where access to education depends on local politics, wealth, or luck. This isn't theoretical, it's real. If we remove the federal background from our education system, we leave students vulnerable to widening disparities and political agendas. That's why this department matters, because education isn't just about test scores. It's about building informed citizens, protecting rights, and investing in our nation's future. So, this battle isn't just happening on Capitol Hill or in courtrooms. It's happening in classrooms, in communities, conversations across the country, and in every single one of us has a role to play. What you could do to help is contact your representatives. Let them know that you're a strong supporter of the Department of Education. Tell them that educational equity isn't optional, it's essential. Stay informed. Legislations like Title I, IDA, and the SSA directly affect millions of students. The more you know, the louder your voice comes. Join advocacy efforts. Support organizations fighting for special education rights, funding public schools, and equal access for all students. And most importantly, vote. Vote like education is on the ballot, because it is. We elect leaders who value public education. We invest in the future of this country. The Department of Education isn't just serving students, it serves democracy, and it needs all of us to stand up for it. So, this is my presentation on why it is important to maintain the Department of Education. And as of March 20th, our president had signed an executive order to slowly separate this department and send it back to certain programs back to the states and separate back to different departments, laying out thousands of people and programs in the process. This is real. This is happening now. Hopefully, we as a community can speak about it and we can share our voices and our concerns. And hopefully, we can maintain those rights for not just our generation, but the generations to come. And hopefully, we can maintain that democracy and brighter future for many generations to come. My name is Nicole Byrne, and this has been my presentation. Thank you.